The twin moons of Veltrax hung low in the dusk sky, casting long, blue shadows across the barren fields. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and old machine oil, the ground cracked and dry under the soft hiss of the wind. In the middle of the nowhere that most people had long forgotten, a small workshop sat crumbling against the endless sand. Inside, Jace wiped the grease from his hands and stared at the battered comm unit blinking on the wall. Someone was coming. He did not get visitors, not here, not after everything. The ground rumbled under the approach of a skimmer craft, its engine sputtering like an old man coughing up ghosts. Jace stepped outside, shielding his eyes against the settling dust. The craft settled on the dirt, sleek and dark, unlike the scavenger rigs that usually roam this part of the world. The ramp hissed open. Out stepped two figures. One was Baron Kurzak, his silver robes gleaming even under the grime of travel, his expression polished smooth like marble. Beside him, a man in heavy armor carried a box. It was large, about the size of a coffin, humming faintly as if something inside it was alive. Jace crossed his arms. "Baron," he said, voice flat. "You are far from your towers." The Baron smiled, all teeth and no warmth. "And you are exactly where I expected, human, still hiding from the stars." Jace said nothing. Kurzak gestured to the box. "A gift, payment for the life of my son." Jace frowned. "I did not save him for a reward." "And yet," the Baron said, stepping closer, "here it is." He motioned, and the armored man set the box down in the dirt with a heavy thud. It unlocked with a hiss. Jace tensed, reaching instinctively for the hidden blade at his belt. But what emerged was not a weapon, it was a girl. She stepped forward slowly, her bare feet silent against the cracked earth. Skin pale with a faint luminescent shimmer, hair white as starlight, eyes wide and clear. She wore a simple shift of fabric, nothing else. She blinked once, twice, like she had never seen the world before. She looked up at Jace and smiled. "I am yours," she said quietly. Jace stiffened. "What is this?" he asked, his voice sharp. "A gift," Kurzak said again, as if explaining to a child. "She was grown in my house's labs, designed to serve, obedient, untouched, yours by right." The girl lowered her head, waiting. Obedient, perfect. Something twisted deep in Jace's chest. He stepped back. The Baron tilted his head, a curious response. Jace shook his head. "No slaves. Not now. Not ever." Kurzak's smile did not falter. "Do as you wish. She is yours to break or to set free. My debt is paid." Without another word, the Baron turned, his cloak trailing dust as he boarded the skimmer. The ship rose into the twilight, engines whining into the distance. Jace stood there staring at the girl left behind. She did not move. She waited, silent, trusting. Not because she knew him, but because she had been made that way. He cursed under his breath. This was not what he wanted, not what he needed, but he could not leave her. He walked forward, slow, hands open where she could see. "You are not mine," he said quietly. She tilted her head. "You were made to believe you belong to someone. You do not. You are free." The words seemed to confuse her. She blinked again. "Free?" He nodded. "Yes." She looked around, as if seeing the horizon for the first time. The broken world, the cracked sky, the endless possibility. She smiled again. But this time, it was different. This time, it was real. Night came quickly on Veltrax. The sky turned a deep shade of indigo, and the stars blinked awake like old sentries returning to their posts. The air grew colder, brittle enough to crackle against the skin. Wind rolled over the sand in lazy, whispering waves, carrying secrets meant to stay buried. Jace sat on the porch of his battered workshop, a steaming cup of synth coffee cradled in his hands. He stared out into the darkness, every muscle tense, even though there was no immediate danger. Old habits died harder than most people. Inside, the girl, Lyra, slept curled on a cot near the workbench. At least she looked like she was sleeping. Every so often, her fingers twitched. Her lips moved without sound. Jace watched her through the doorway, the dim lights casting long shadows across the walls. He had given her water, food, a place to rest, and he had asked her nothing. Not her origins, not her programming, not her purpose. Because he already knew one thing that mattered. She deserved the choice to tell him when she was ready. But even he could not predict what would come next. At exactly midnight, the humming began. Soft at first, almost gentle. Then it grew. A pulse, slow and deliberate. Jace stood, setting down his cup. The air smelled different now. Ozone and burning metal, a scent he recognized from his time on battlefields where machines wept before they died. He stepped inside. Lyra sat upright on the cot, eyes wide, pupils dilated so far her irises were almost gone. Her body trembled as if an invisible current raced through her veins. Jace moved cautiously. "Lyra!" She gasped. Her hands clutched her chest. "It hurts," she whispered. He knelt beside her. "What hurts?" "Everything." She doubled over, shaking. Before Jace could reach her, her body jerked back violently. A beam of blue light burst from her spine, shooting straight through the roof of the workshop and into the night sky. Jace ducked instinctively, shielding his eyes. The beam pulsed once, twice, then vanished. Lyra collapsed forward into his arms, her breathing shallow. He lifted her easily, laying her back on the cot. Static crackled from the comm units bolted to the walls. All of them, even the dead ones. An emergency channel flickered on. Coordinates, a signal. Someone was coming, or worse, they already knew. Jace checked her pulse. Still strong, but different now, as if something inside her had awakened. Something that had slept too long. He ran a hand through his hair, muttering under his breath. "Damn it, Kurzak." He looked down at the girl in his arms. She had trusted him, without question. And now, because of that trust, they were both targets. He covered her with a blanket, grabbed the emergency bag from under the floorboards and started packing. Ammo, rations, portable shields. Whatever came next, they would face it together. He glanced once more at the sky. The beam would have been seen from orbit, maybe even further. Whatever Lyra truly was. They would come for her now, all of them. And Jace knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let them take her. Not while he still drew breath. The desert stretched endless and black under the cold gaze of the stars. Jace moved fast, boots crunching over brittle sand, his arms cradling Lyra's limp form against his chest. Each breath misted in the frozen air, but he ignored the burn in his lungs. His mind raced faster than his feet. They could not stay at the workshop. Not anymore. The signal Lyra had unleashed was like a flare in the night. Every bounty hunter, mercenary, and syndicate agent with a scanner would be racing toward them now. And whatever government forces had once claimed to disavow experiments like Lyra, they would come too. The old caves, Jace thought grimly. No communications, no sensors, only stone and silence. It would buy them time. Maybe enough. Hours later, tucked deep within the crumbling remains of an ancient mining shaft, Jace laid her down on a slab of flat rock. He lit a small lantern, its blue glow pushing back the darkness, and knelt beside her. Lyra stirred, her fingers twitching weakly. Her skin was colder now, too pale even under the soft light. Jace checked her vitals. Strong heartbeat, erratic breathing. Her body was fighting itself, or something inside her. He pushed her hair back gently and froze. Just below the hairline at the base of her neck, something glinted. A small metallic disc, no larger than his thumbnail, half buried beneath her skin. A control implant. Standard military design. Outlawed decades ago. But here it was. Alive and pulsing faintly with a red glow. Jace cursed under his breath. He had seen these before. Implants designed to command, to monitor, to control, to kill. Whoever had made Lyra never intended for her to be free. Even if her mind was willing, her body could be overridden with a single transmitted code. He dug into his pack, pulling out a medkit, a blade, a sterilizer, trembling slightly as the possibilities slammed into him. If he left it in, they could activate it any time. Turn her against herself, against him. If he removed it, she could die. The implant was wired deep into the nervous system. Tearing it out wrong could collapse her heart or fry her brain. He stared at her peaceful face, the faint rise and fall of her chest. She had trusted him, without hesitation. Jace gritted his teeth. He did not deserve her trust, but he would fight like hell to honor it. He prepped the blade. Hands steady now, breathing slow. "This will hurt," he whispered. Maybe not for her, but for him. He pressed the blade to her skin, a tiny cut. Blood welled up, dark against her pale flesh. The implant resisted, its metal filaments twitching like living nerves. Jace cursed again. This was not technology. This was a parasite. Part machine, part biological. It fought to stay inside her. He worked carefully, separating the tendrils one by one. Lyra whimpered. Her body arched. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Jace moved faster, slicing, isolating. The final filament snapped free with a crackle of blue light. The implant dropped into his palm, still twitching, still alive. He crushed it under his boot without a second thought. It sparked, then died. Lyra gasped. Her body jerked once, twice, then stilled. Jace held his breath. Her chest rose, fell, again, and slowly, her color returned. Warmth spread back into her limbs. He slumped back against the wall, exhausted beyond words, watching her sleep under the flickering light. The air felt different now, clean, free. She was no longer a prisoner to someone else's command. She was truly hers now. And for the first time since she had stepped out of that cursed box, Jace allowed himself to believe it might be possible. Freedom, not just survival, but life. Far above the cave, in orbit high above Veltrax, a silent alarm blinked on an ancient warship. Catalyst Alpha has been awakened. Authorization, hunt and retrieve. Multiple fleets shifted course, all targeting the same beacon, all preparing for war. And down below, Jace tightened his grip on the old rifle leaning beside him. Let them come. He was ready, because for the first time in a long time, he had something worth protecting, and he would not fail her. Not now, not ever. The sun rose over Veltrax in a thin, sickly line, barely strong enough to burn away the mist that clung to the broken hills. The desert shimmered with heat already, but under the surface the cold tension of coming war seeped into the cracks of the world. Jace stood at the mouth of the cave, the old rifle resting against his shoulder. His eyes swept the horizon, tracing the faint lines of dust thrown up by something approaching fast. They were coming, and not just bounty hunters this time. Real soldiers, real killers. He could see the glint of armored transports cresting the far ridge, sleek black machines cutting through the sand with cold efficiency. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning, searching. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath. Behind him, deeper in the cave, Lyra stirred. She moved differently now. The stiffness from her confinement had faded. Her steps were lighter, but her gaze had changed. There was a depth in her eyes that had not been there before, as if the removal of the implant had unleashed something old, something that remembered what had been hidden. She stood beside him without speaking. She did not flinch at the sight of the soldiers. She did not ask if they would survive. Instead, she looked at him and said softly, "I remember." Jace tore his gaze from the approaching forces. "Remember what?" Lyra touched her chest. "I was made to be a catalyst, to change battlefields, to break sieges, to unmake empires." He swallowed hard. "And can you?" She looked down at her hands. A faint ripple of energy shimmered across her skin, distorting the air around her fingertips. "I do not want to, but if they force me..." She closed her eyes. "I will not be their weapon. Not again." Jace nodded once. "Then we make our stand here, together." The first transport slammed to a halt 100 meters away, sand spraying in great clouds. Armored figures disembarked, moving in practiced formation. Weapons raised. Drones swept lower, lasers locking on to heat signatures. Jace lifted his rifle. The first shot rang out, sharp and precise. The first drone exploded mid-air, raining sparks down on the soldiers below. Chaos followed. The soldiers fanned out, firing pulse rounds into the cave entrance. Rocks splintered. Dust filled the air. Jace ducked behind the stone wall, returning fire in tight bursts, aiming to disable, not to kill. They were not ready for Lyra. She stepped into the open, unarmed, unafraid. Bullets streaked toward her. She raised one hand. The air around her shimmered. The bullets bent away, twisting harmlessly into the sand. The soldiers hesitated. Lyra's eyes glowed faintly. She spread her arms and a wave of kinetic energy blasted outward, knocking the front line off their feet like leaves in a storm. Weapons tumbled from stunned hands. Shields sparked and failed. Jace stared, awestruck. She was not a soldier. She was a force of nature. The commander of the unit barked orders, rallying his troops. Target the girl. Contain her. Neutralize the asset. Lyra stepped forward, calm. I am not your asset, she said. Her voice rolled across the battlefield like thunder. And I will not be contained. Another pulse erupted from her body, cracking the earth beneath their boots. Vehicles flipped. Soldiers scrambled for cover, fear finally breaking through their discipline. Jace moved with her, covering her sides, taking down any who dared get close. They fought as one, without plan, without command, only trust. Minutes later, the battlefield was silent. The surviving soldiers lay unconscious or fled into the desert. The drones were smoking ruins on the sand. Lyra stood in the center, her chest heaving with exertion, her hair wild around her face. She looked more alive now than she ever had. Jace approached her carefully. You good? She nodded. For now. He touched her shoulder gently. You saved us. No, she said, her voice low. We saved each other. Far above in the blackness of orbit, captains and admirals watched the battle through trembling hands. This was not supposed to happen. Catalyst Alpha was awake, free, and worse, she had chosen her own path. The orders came swiftly. Mobilize fleets, secure Veltrax, erase all evidence. But even they could not deny what they had seen. Catalyst Alpha was not just a weapon. She was a revolution, and she had a protector now. The desert rolled endless and cruel under the broken sun. Jace pushed the skimmer to its limits, the battered machine screaming against the sand winds as they fled across the wastelands. Behind them, thin trails of dust twisted into the sky, hunters still on their tail, desperate to recapture what they had lost. Lyra sat beside him, her body swaying with the jolts and lurches of the old skimmer. She was quiet, but not afraid. Her eyes, once clouded by confusion, were sharp now, reflecting the barren world rushing past them. They had fought. They had survived. But survival was not enough. Jace glanced at her, shouting over the engine noise. We cannot outrun them forever. Lyra nodded once. Then we stop running. Not yet, he said grimly. There's someone we have to find first. She tilted her head. Who? An old engineer. Name's Balak. He used to build machines for the corporations before he got sick of being used. If anyone can help us, help you, it's him. Lyra said nothing, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the skimmer seat. She trusted him. That was enough. Hours later, they reached the ruins of an abandoned relay station. Half buried in sand and time, the building leaned against the horizon like a drunk too tired to fall. Solar panels hung shattered from rusted beams. The air smelled of oil and old metal. Jace parked the skimmer and climbed out, motioning for Lyra to stay behind him. Inside, the ruins creaked and moaned. A figure emerged from the shadows, short, thick-shouldered, his face hidden behind a welding mask. He carried a plasma cutter like a man would carry a cane. Jace raised a hand. Balak, the figure grunted. Heard you were dead, human. Not yet, Jace said. The mask lifted. A grizzled face stared back at him, one eye cybernetic, the other sharp as broken glass. You brought trouble. Jace nodded. The worst kind. Balak's gaze shifted to Lyra. She's pretty. She's dangerous. Good, Balak said and turned away. Follow me. Inside the workshop, among the ruins, Balak scanned Lyra. Small device, old tech, good hands, bad heart. He grunted. You got a live one here. Jace folded his arms. Can you help her? Balak scratched his beard. Depends. You want her dead? Or free? Free, Jace said without hesitation. The old engineer grinned. Then it's gonna hurt. He turned to Lyra. And not just you, girl. He led them to a battered operating table, pulled out a case of tools that looked more like weapons. Jace felt Lyra's hand brush his. Software, not pleading, just asking. He squeezed back. Whatever it takes, he whispered. She nodded once and lay down. Balak cracked his knuckles. Let's see what the bastard's buried inside you. The procedure was brutal. Balak dug deep into her spinal connectors, bypassing dead zones and rewired subroutines designed to trigger shutdown or self-destruction if tampered with. Lyra's body jerked. Once. Twice. She bit down on the pain, refusing to scream. Jace sat beside her, wiping the sweat from her forehead, whispering soft encouragement. Almost there, Balak muttered. Almost. There was a snap, a flash of blue light. The old engineer stumbled back, coughing. It's done, he said. You're clean. Jace looked down. Lyra's body relaxed. Her breathing slowed, then steadied. She opened her eyes slowly and smiled. A real smile. Not programmed, not ordered. Heron outside, the world still burned. Hunters closed in, ships circled overhead. But inside that ruined station, something stronger than fear was born. Choice. The freedom. Lyra sat up, wincing. Jace offered his hand. She took it. No hesitation, no command. Her choice. And together they stepped back into the light. Far above, a transmission crackled through the dark channels of the fleet command. Catalyst Alpha has severed command chains. Warning, autonomy detected. Threat level, maximum. Orders updated. Engage at all costs. The desert winds screamed across the wastelands like a wounded beast. Jace and Lyra moved fast, riding the old skimmer toward the high canyons where the signal could not reach. Above them, the sky darkened, not from storms, but from ships. Warships, dozens. Their silhouettes blackened the stars. From the comms unit strapped to the side of the skimmer, a message crackled through, cold and merciless. Catalyst Alpha. Stand down. You will be destroyed if you resist. Lyra sat rigid beside Jace, her hands clenched into fists, her hair whipping wild in the wind. The implant was gone. Her mind was her own, but the world that had made her still refused to let her go. Jace looked at her, voice steady despite the terror clawing at his gut. What do you want to do? Lyra stared ahead. Her voice was low. They will not stop until I am dead. He nodded. Then we give them a reason to be afraid. They abandoned the skimmer at the mouth of the canyons. The ships descended, engines roaring like thunder, lights cutting through the dust and ash. Soldiers poured from the transports, armored and armed to the teeth. Jace stood with Lyra at the cliff's edge. He chambered the last round into his rifle. Not enough to win, not even close, but he would stand until he fell. He glanced at her one last time. You do not have to fight. She turned to him, eyes burning with something older and stronger than rage. I am not fighting for revenge. She took his hand. I am fighting for choice. The soldiers surrounded them. The commander stepped forward, helmet gleaming under the dying light. Catalyst Alpha. Return to custody. This is your final warning. Lyra stepped ahead of Jace. She raised both hands. And the sky changed. The very air trembled. The sands lifted from the ground, spiraling around her like golden smoke. Energy pulsed from her chest, a living heartbeat that shook the stones under their feet. Soldiers faltered, weapons lowered. A voice rolled from Lyra, not hers alone, but deeper, vaster, a chorus of every life that had been shaped and broken by the ones who had created her. I am not your weapon. I am not your property. I am not your fear. I am myself. The ground cracked outward in a ring. A shock wave of pure force knocked the soldiers sprawling. Above, the warship shuddered. Lights flickered. Engines sputtered. Systems failed. Jace shielded his eyes from the blinding light. When he looked again, the soldiers were gone. The ships retreating. Not out of defeat, out of awe, out of recognition. Lyra collapsed to her knees, breathing hard, spent. Jace rushed to her side, caught her before she could fall. He pulled her close. You are more than they will ever understand. She smiled weakly. So are you. He laughed, choked and broken. Come on, he said, helping her stand. Let's go find a place where the sky does not know our names. She leaned on him, and together they walked into the endless desert, toward a future they would choose. not one chosen for them. Far above, in the command deck of the retreating fleet, the admiral stared in stunned silence. One spoke finally. She chose. Another nodded. Then she is no longer our weapon. She is the beginning of something we cannot stop. They powered down their weapons, turned their ships toward the distant stars, and left Catalyst Alpha to the life she had reclaimed. The desert had changed. Where once the sand stretched lifeless and hollow, now small patches of green had begun to take root. Thin vines climbed the rocks. Wildflowers dotted the broken earth, stubborn in their survival. At the edge of the canyon, a new shelter stood, built from the wreckage of fallen ships, stitched together by human hands and alien resilience. Solar panels tilted toward the sky. A garden sprouted beside a small spring. It was not much, but it was theirs. Inside, Jace knelt over an open terminal, soldering together a circuit with steady, patient hands. The smell of heated metal filled the room, mixing with the sharper scent of fresh herbs hanging to dry by the window. Across the room, Lyra tended the plants. Her hands, once shaped for destruction, now nurtured life. She hummed softly, a melody Jace did not recognize but loved all the same. He looked up, watching her for a moment. Not because she needed protection, but because she had become something he had never dared to dream of before. Free, whole. His gaze drifted to the crystal she wore around her neck, a fragment salvaged from the warship debris. Not as a trophy, as a reminder of what she had survived, of what she had chosen. Later they sat together under the open stars. The air was cool, the fire between them crackled softly. Lyra leaned back, staring at the night sky with a small, peaceful smile. "Do you think they will come back?" she asked. Jace shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. If they do?" He poked the fire with a stick. "Then we remind them that some things cannot be owned." She turned to him. "Thank you, Jace." "For what?" "For not trying to fix me." He smiled. "You were never broken." She laughed, the sound light and real, not the laugh of a weapon, not the laugh of an experiment, the laugh of a girl who had built her own soul. They spoke little after that. Words were not needed. The fire burned low. The stars wheeled overhead. The desert, once a graveyard, now whispered of beginnings. Jace leaned back on his elbows, the ground cool beneath him, and glanced sideways at her. "You ever think about leaving?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I do not need to run anymore." She smiled at him, slow and soft. "I am already where I chose to be." He smiled back. "Good. Me too." They sat like that for a long time. Two survivors, two builders, two people who had found something better than safety. They had found each other. Not because fate demanded it, but because they chose it, every day, again and again. Far away beyond the stars, empires shifted and rose and fell. But on a small patch of stubborn earth under an endless sky, a girl who was never meant to be free built a new life, and a man who once believed he had nothing left to give learned that sometimes giving your heart costs nothing at all. Years passed on Veltrax. Seasons shifted, though the desert changed slower than the stars above. The small shelter at the canyon's edge grew into something more. Gardens stretched wider. Solar panels multiplied. A few travelers, lost or seeking refuge, found their way there and stayed. Not because they were asked, but because hope has a way of calling those who need it most. They called the place New Ember. No banners, no rulers, just a quiet beacon against the dark. And at the heart of it all were two figures, one human, one catalyst, neither belonging to anyone but each other. Children would sometimes ask Lyra why she wore the small crystal around her neck. She would kneel down, smiling, and tell them a simple story. Once there was a girl who was made to destroy. She was built in secret, shaped by hands that believed they owned her. But one day when she was given away like a tool, she met someone who did not see a weapon. He saw a choice. He saw her. And because of that, she remembered she was never meant to belong to anyone, except herself. The children would listen, wide-eyed, and they would ask, "Is it true you could tear down the sky?" She would laugh gently. "Yes," she would say, "but I chose to plant gardens instead." Sometimes Jace would sit under the twin moons, watching them chase each other across the sky. He would run his fingers along the worn handle of his old rifle, now mounted above the door like a relic from another life. He knew the world beyond still spun in chaos, still fought wars, still whispered about Catalyst Alpha and fearful legends. But here, in this small corner of the universe, peace was real, because they had chosen it. Every day, every hour, choice was the greatest rebellion, and they had won. Not with armies, not with fire, but with stubborn love, with freedom, with simply refusing to be anything but themselves. Their names faded from history books. Governments collapsed and rose again. But on maps drawn by travelers passing through the silent edges of Veltrax, there was always a small mark. New Ember. And beside it, sometimes scribbled in messy handwriting, a note. Here is where the weapon became a woman. Here is where the end became a beginning. Here is where freedom was born. Now tell us, if you were given the power to destroy or to heal, which would you choose? Would you burn the sky, or would you plant gardens beneath it? Share your answer in the comments, because sometimes the smallest choices change everything.